Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. I have got a stellar show for you guys today. I think you're going to love this. I am I'm just hitting a few more buttons here, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. So, in the heart of the Sacred Valley of Peru, where the ancient meets the cutting edge, a new frontier of understanding is emerging. Luke Jensen stands at the intersection of neuroscience, anthropology, and the mystical realm of plant medicines. As a neurofeedback practitioner and researcher, Luke has embarked on a groundbreaking journey to map the human brain during one of the most profound spiritual experiences. For the first time in history, Luke's work captures the brain's enigmatic dance through EEG and QEEG imaging before, during, and after encounters with this sacred plant medicine. His research not only pushes the boundaries of neuroscience, but also ventures into the depths of human consciousness, trauma, and the soul itself. Luke's work reveals a fascinating paradox. While every brain responds differently to plant medicines, they all seem to heal and move towards balance, as if guided by an unseen hand. With inspiration from his mentor, Dr. Richard Soutar, and an unwavering curiosity about the mysteries of the mind, Luke is helping to uncover how plant medicines transform the brain and perhaps even the essence of what it means to be human. Today, we dive into the questions of his work raises. How does trauma store itself in the brain? What happens when plant medicines begin to heal these wounds? And what can this research teach us about consciousness itself? It's a privilege to welcome Luke Jensen, a pioneer at the edge of science and spirit, to the show. Luke, thanks so much for being here today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate what you're doing down there, man, and I can't wait for the people today to learn more. And it seems like this might be the year of Luke Jensen, man. You're exploding down there. You got all kinds of cool stuff going on, man. Why don't you just give us a little snippet of maybe a little bit of background and what's going on today in your world?
Yeah, so 10 years ago, I visited Peru for the first time after deploying in Afghanistan. I was in the Marines. I found a lot of healing through plant medicines, ayahuasca. It really opened me up to another world. And then soon after that, a friend brain mapped me, the QEEG brain map. And I learned about neuroscience, this whole other realm. And, for me, it was such an empowering thing. She does this brain map. She goes, oh, you have a pattern for PTSD, and you can train that away. So for me, this is really cool. It wasn't like talk therapy, which, I was a tough Marine. I didn't really want to do that. It wasn't prescription medication, which I was, into natural health back then. So I wasn't into that route. But, you just train this brainwave. And then I started researching this technology, and I realized there's tons of spiritual implications because, our body, our brain, our nervous system is a seat of consciousness. So you learn how to control that. You can control meditative states, deep states, spiritual states. So it was my idea to combine these two modalities together. I showed up to a conference. I met my mentor there named Dr. Richard Soutar. And he goes, I've been waiting to meet someone like you. I'll train you. So that was about 5 years ago now. I've been working with him very closely for 5 years. And so part of what I do is research. I study plant medicines with QEEG brain mapping in a unique way, I would say. I published 2 studies in this last year. Since last December, I published 2 studies. One on ayahuasca, pre and post brain maps, which I think is the only study to ever do this, to track changes over time. Other studies will take a brain map during the experience, but no one's tracking change, which I think is very interesting. And then I also published a study in Huachuma, which is the first study to ever brain image Huachuma. So no one's actually ever done that before, at least published it. So that means MRI, SPECT scans, QEGs, EEGs, no one's actually ever measured it in that way. So that was also really cool. So all those things happened within the last year. We started running around retreats, which we combine. This is kind of inspiration that I want to do a long time. And, things come together. I don't know if I was ready for it yet, but a friend came, like, goes, hey, I want to come to Peru and run a retreat. I'm like, okay, we'll make it happen. And our retreats do pre and post brain mapping. So everyone that comes through, they can see the change in their brain after 3 ayahuasca ceremonies and a Huachuma ceremony. It's a very validating experience because you can show them, like, anxiety is lifting, depression is lifting, and like, oh, okay, this wasn't just in my head. There's like new neural pathways happening, and it really validates the experience and shows them something happened. So it's been a really interesting time, and now we have a documentary coming out soon. We just finished it, and we did a couple local showings with it. We don't have an exact date yet, but it's all been a really wild ride this last year, I would say.
Man, I wish I had the. Did you? I wish I had the map of your brain before all this started happening, and then the map afterwards. I bet you it's off the charts, man.
Well, when you start getting into brain mapping and get into the science, I wish I had brain maps all throughout my life.
Right.
Before the Marine Corps, after the Marine Corps. What was my childhood brain like? But yeah, so since I started doing this, I probably have done like 15 brain maps. And the beautiful thing about what I do is I do the brain mapping, but also do the neurofeedback. So I train states. So when I train the brain, there's really no upper limit on that. And there's really no limit of learning. So I'm constantly trying different methodologies. I have my core neurofeedback methods I use on myself and the people that are close to me that I'm working with all the time. But there's really no upper limit to the brain. You can train it forever. And just like a meditator can like get new depths of meditation 30 years later, the brain's a similar thing. There's no limit. And when you're training the brain, those neural pathways are strengthening. Everything's getting stronger. You're more resilient. And it's been a very powerful process for me and the people I work with. So
what does that look like when you're training the brain? Like, are you watching do you see what does that look like? Do you see when you see the neural feedback, is that a set of lines that come in waves? And if so, when you look at those waves, you just try to reimagine the state that you were in to continue to have that particular pattern, or how do you train it?
That's a really good question. So how we train the brain. So it looks differently from the person that's trained the brain. I'm interfacing with their brain through my computer, right? So on my computer, I see their brain waves live. But the person that's training it on their brain, it's either eyes closed or eyes open. And there's a reward system. It's operant conditioning. So if the eyes open, the screen will get lighter or darker, depending if they're the right brainwave or not. So say someone has ADD, the classic pattern is a high theta pattern. They can't focus. So, and then we want like a low beta pattern, relaxed focus. We want to train that up. So when they get the right brainwave, the screen gets lighter and rewards them. When they're in the wrong state, it gets darker. So rewarding a healthy pattern. And in this case, it's a really good analogy that it's a mirror in front of the brain. The first time the mirror is seeing a reflection of itself. So the brain wants to become more healthy. So the brain is doing millions of calculations a second that you can't do consciously, but it's doing it itself because you just show it the path and it wants to become more healthy. So that's the eyes open training. The eyes closed training, you'll hear a tone. So we do eyes closed for more relaxing states, meditative states, deep states, enigmatic states, and it rewards you the tone, and you'll slowly go into these deeper states as you hear the tone more. So say a meditator, it takes a meditator maybe years to learn meditation because they have to figure out that brainwave for themselves. But with this technology, we can reward that exact brainwave. The brain was like, oh, okay, this is where I need to go. So in that situation, the reward with the tone. And on my end, I can see their brainwaves. So I can see them moving in a healthy state, or I can see their brain regulating. So it's very interesting. It's the only modality I know of where I can see actually trauma lifting from the body because I can see the brain become more healthy. And that's the beautiful thing about plant medicines. I love plant medicines, but sometimes it's hard to tell, like, well, how far have I progressed? What has that done for me? And that's why I integrate the two, because I can directly see what's happening in the brain.
Yeah, and I think it sort of is beginning to bridge that gap between quantifiable and unquantifiable, because it seems like that's one of the things that's missing from clinical trials is his ability to really, okay, well, where's the results? Can you show us the results? Well, I can show you that my husband's less of an asshole. I can show you these tears of joy for someone that doesn't have this addiction anymore. People are like, yeah, I got it, but I want to see the actual results, man. And it sounds like that's kind of what some of the things you're doing might be able to prove.
Well, yeah, I agree. So the people who use plant medicines, they have that subjective experience,
Yeah.
which is very, very powerful. They know that something amazing happened, but science uses observation, and we're a
Right.
culture of science. We're a culture of the scientific method. So how do you reach those people, right? And my objective is not to explain away consciousness itself. I think this deepens that. Like I never will explain away someone's visions, and I think some
Yeah.
people worry about that when I first talk about science. Like, no, I'm not. That's not my objective. My objective is to understand deeper how the healing works. And what we do is with our studies, we'll have a questionnaire study that's really related to neurophysiology,
Right.
and then we'll have the brain mapping. So we're the first studies of this kind I know of. We're tracking questionnaires and the brain maps at the same time, pre and post, so that both can validate each other. So, for example, we had one person in our ayahuasca study that had like really strong symptoms of self-reported ADD. That's what he reported on his questionnaire, and his brain pattern showed the classical high theta pattern for ADD, like dissociation, can't focus. After 3 ayahuasca ceremonies, that pattern was gone. The self-report symptoms were gone. So I believe we're the first person to report on this for ADD, but this gives us insight into healing, right? So wait, what does that mean about ADD? Maybe it's a trauma response. Maybe that person's dissociation not to feel trauma. So we're getting new insights into trauma itself, how mind works, how psychology works, and who we are as conscious beings. So I think a lot of retreats, they'll say, we change we change the world one person at a time. But if we create the science, the data, this is how you change a culture. This is how you change a civilization, because you built these data sets that no one can argue with it. Like, hey, these are pre and post brain maps with 100 people or 1,000 people. And that's our goal, to keep building those data sets up and have larger analysis.
Yeah, it seems like one of those things, the more you have, the more concrete the evidence. Like, especially when you start talking about patterns, right? Like if you have there's that the logical fallacy of a small representation set, but the bigger set you have, the more difficult it is to argue against, right?
Yeah, so our initial studies are small data sets, and that's really good for exploratory research. Our
Right.
goal isn't the double blind, classical, gold standard, as they say it. But we're getting this data no one else has received, and
Right.
as we get, hopefully maybe get grants or something like that, we can start connecting more
Yeah.
studies. But just doing what we do, doing retreats, we're building that data set up. So eventually, as we get to a higher percentage, like, you know, how many brain maps do people need to see? We're like, wait, there's something going on here for sure, right?
Yeah.
And that's really my goal, is to build that data set to say, like, hey, we have pre and post data maps for, say, like 100 people or 200 people or more, as the years go on. And if we see these distinct trends, what does that mean? Like, something's going on. And I think many people are still stuck in this mindset, or that this is just some kind of like hippie stuff, or it's just some kind of hallucination that people are having. Well, even if that's true, I don't think that's true, but even if that is true, it's obviously changing people's lives, right? And I think this should be interesting, because some people come back and maybe get married, or maybe get divorced, or maybe start a new hobby, or maybe like start singing or music or painting. Like, something's happening, and I think it's our job as human beings to be bold and try to figure that out.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more. I think it speaks to the world of integration as well, too. I know a lot. I get to speak to a lot of really cool people who have these really interesting techniques about helping people not only make changes in their life, but maintain those changes. And it seems to me, with sort of the neural network the biofeedback, or the brain mapping, like that's a pretty powerful tool for people to see that resonates with them. Like, oh, I can see the changes, I can feel the changes, and I can see them. That sounds like something that could be a huge part of integration.
No, I mean, yeah, that's one of the things I really focus on. I'm glad you brought it up, because, um, for me personally, everyone's different. For me,
Yeah.
I had a really bad PTSD. I came down to Peru for the first time. I had a really powerful experience. Like 3 months. For 3 months after that, I was great. I was feeling awesome. And then old thought patterns came back, and old things like that came back. Anxieties came back, and the same thing would go back down again, do ayahuasca, and then like the same thing would happen again. So for me, the neurofeedback was the daily practice that really got me where I wanted to go. The ayahuasca gave me insight, and the neurofeedback complemented perfectly, because I couldn't do ayahuasca every day, but I could train these deep states and keep releasing trauma. So actually, one of our main modalities is using integration with neurofeedback. So people go home, and I can send them a home training unit, and they can keep training and progressing. And it doesn't have to stop after doing the ayahuasca. You can keep progressing and have insights and training spiritual states. So I send people home. I can send people home with a device after they visit Peru, but also I can train anyone in the world who hasn't done plant medicines. Say, I'm not ready for that yet. I'm not sure if I'm ready for Peru yet. And they can prepare for ayahuasca, say, with neurofeedback, or just do their own work, spiritual work without neurofeedback, or without ayahuasca, and just use the spiritual training to the neurofeedback training to reach spiritual states. So I have some people I work with that have never been to Peru, and they just want an edge. Or some people might have head trauma, or some people might have anxiety, or some people have ADD. So we can train the brain. It can be so effective for so many different things.
Yeah, I keep going back in my mind. I keep going back to this idea that you said a few moments ago about putting a mirror in front of the brain. And I can't help but think of the psychedelic states, at least for me, allow me almost like a third person point of view. And it's so meta to start thinking about a mirror in front of your brain. Like that's, you know what I mean? On some level, it blows my mind, because it's a great way to change your awareness. It's a great way to think in almost another dimensionality. And that's where real changes can be made, outside the ideas of shame, outside the ideas of guilt, outside the ideas of self. You can really get to look at yourself in a way that is non-judgmental. And that's where real patterns can be observed and changed, it seems like to me.
No, what you say is huge, because when I started doing this, it really blew my mind, because all of a sudden my brain is doing the work and I'm not. What does that mean? What's that imply? What's that imply for mind? What's that imply for consciousness? And just like what you're saying, that the observer effect that maybe Eastern religions are talking about for a while, and then we're bringing this back through science, right? And we're seeing it right here. So yeah, I think it adds a depth to everything you're saying right there.
Yeah, it blows my mind. We got a question coming in. It says, is the balance and healing observed in the brain under the influence of plant medicines evidence of a deeper universal intelligence within us?
Well, yeah, I think it speaks to a lot of things. I think it speaks to intelligence within the plants. How is this happening? Like, what's that imply? And I think it speaks to intelligence within us, and that intelligence that allows those two things to link. There's something going on. I think there's a lot of mysteries to be explored, but yeah, that's exactly what's being demonstrated by these things.
Yes, the essence mirrors are a way to reflect in the moment. Yeah, it's I've never even heard that term, essence mirrors, before, but it's out there, I guess. Have you heard that term before, Luke?
Essen or Essene? I don't know.
A scene, I'm sorry. A scene mirrors. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm not exactly sure, but wasn't into the scenes like a spiritual movement in like in the desert? I don't know. So I'm not sure.
I'm gonna look it up here. We got another question coming. It says, does your research suggest that the brain itself holds a map to spiritual awakening, or is the process driven by something beyond the physical?
Yeah. So the beautiful thing about mapping is that it does allow a path, right? Because say just standard neurofeedback, I can take a map of somebody where they're dysregulated, and I have an idea where I want to go, where they want to go, become healthy, right? To relieve anxiety, depression. And those things are spiritual. If someone's operating less out of anxiety, less out of trauma, more from their heart, right? More from their soul, that's spiritual itself. And then we can train these deep states. We know how to get to them. And as far as brain mapping goes, we can see meditation all the way up to Satori. We can't see past that. So there's probably something going on at a quantum level or these micro networks that we can't see, but we can see a lot of it. And it's very interesting. So
Yeah, it makes me wonder. Do you think we could tell a lot about culture about if we use neurofeedback? I would imagine that if you were to map someone's brain who lives in Southern California, was born and raised there, versus someone who lives in the Sacred Valley, I bet you they have a different set of brain waves going on, right? And is that reflective of culture on some level?
yeah, I think so. My mentor talks about this because he's in the field for 3 or 4 decades now, or maybe more. I think around that time. But he has seen patterns change over time, like patterns. So the pattern we're seeing a lot now is what we call perseverance, or a busy mind that can't slow down. And I think this has a lot to do with technology. People always look at their iPhones and distractions. So we're seeing that in their brain patterns reflecting back. So I think at different points in time, different cultural, constructs, we'll see different patterns for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about what that means for us. I think that once you get good at once you get good at sort of understanding the data, then you can begin to see not only patterns like ADD, but just mental illness and mental wellness as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, we have a natural homeostatic state that our bodies desire to be in. And I think ancient times was much easier, but with modern diet and the stresses and all these things, it's created a situation where it's harder to achieve that. But with this technology, it really opens it up for that healing and healing the natural process for human beings. We just have to allow ourselves to do it.
Yeah. So you got a new documentary coming out in the next few months. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, man. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, no. So, yeah, where life takes you. I did not think I'd have a documentary coming out. I met a friend in jiu-jitsu, and turns out he's a documentary filmmaker, and the people you meet in Peru sometimes, he used to work, he's from Spain, but he worked for the London Reel. He was in London, making big time productions, and then he just kind of fell in love with plants and plant medicines. I was living in Peru, and I'm like, well, hey, I'd love you to make a documentary for me. And at the time, like, both poor, I don't really have any money because we're living in Peru and just, getting by. And I mentioned to my mentor, Dr. Richard Soutar, and his company, New Mind Technologies, and he said he would sponsor it, which was a huge, huge deal for me to be sponsored by someone. And he said he'd sponsor it. So we did a retreat last March. I had a good friend that came down. He actually had seen him for like 10, 15 years before that. He was my unit. And, before that, he wrote a book about a dog that he had that like changed his life. And his dog had cancer. So he took this dog around the States for 6 months for the last months of its life and had this beautiful moments with his dog and had this huge social media following. Even went on Today's Show and wrote a book. I'm like, well, hey, come down here. Let's have another adventure. So the documentary tracks his story with plant medicines and healing his trauma. His brother died in Iraq, actually. And my story, and then how the neurofeedback and plant medicines come together. So it's a really beautiful story arc, and it's a really powerful way to explain how plant medicines and brain map and neurofeedback can be applied to go together, and how this benefits my friend at a personal level. So it's really powerful.
Nice. Ollie, thanks for joining in, man. We got Luke Jensen on the line over here. Luke, this is Ollie. Ollie, this is Luke. I'm so stoked you're both here. Ollie, how's it going, man? We're just talking about some neurofeedback and psychedelics, man.
Amazing. Thanks so much, George. Nice to meet you, Luke. Yeah, great to join you guys. And really fascinated to hear. Really fascinated to hear about neurofeedback and psychedelics. I know a little bit. I've chatted to my friend Heather Hargraves quite a bit about neurofeedback. Don't know if you've heard of her. I've had experience neurofeedback done, used the helium hardware, and really fascinated to hear more, because I've got such limited experience in that space.
Well, cool. Yeah, I mean, I've been probably reading books about neurofeedback for like 10 years now because I'm so fascinated with it, but professionally for 5. And it's one of those fields that you'll always be learning because it's the brain, the mind, and then and you bring plant medicines like the soul, consciousness. So yeah, I mean, it's been really amazing.
We were just talking, Ollie, about how it gives an individual something visceral to look at. So many of the psychedelic states seem to be subjective, even though they're full of powerful, profound changes. A lot of it is subjective, and science seems like we want something to grab onto. Do you think neurofeedback could be that sort of link that we're looking for to really sort of have something to look at to match up these subjective states?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. For me, my experience was of this interface in a way that you're talking about, almost a standardized interface. I was engaging with some hardware and some software, and it was quite clear. And I had headphones and a Muse headband on, so there were very tangible things that I was engaging with. So in that sense, it prepped the system, I think, so to speak, which might be a bit different to psychedelics. You know, people often talk about psychedelics as a form of technology, which I think is a really interesting way of talking about them. My friend Darren LeBaron, who's an expert mushroom cultivator, speaks a lot about mushrooms as technology. I still think we're a little bit behind that in terms of our actual experience of them as technology. And it's really useful having these interfaces that can standardize a model or a program to help us engage. And that's what I found so profound with my neurofeedback experience, was almost this disbelief that someone could say to me, you're going to engage with this is the intention, and if you do these things, this is essentially what you'll achieve. And I was like, okay. I went in open-minded. I was really calm about it. And I think I started crying during the experience, because it was just that feeling of knowing of where to hold it, where to hold that resonance, and how easy it was to drop out of that resonance, but also how easy it was just to go back into it. And it was almost like a warm hug or something, someone telling me, hey, you can do this. It's okay. You almost have a choice of how to resonate. And that for me was so powerful. And I think, you know, it was without language. The person who directed me was speaking in English, but the actual experience was a non-linguistic experience. It was an energetic resonance experience. That's the only way I can describe it. And I guess, you know, it is that entrainment. It's that self-regulation of the brainwaves that you're doing to yourself, and realizing how powerful the human brain is, but using the technology. It's almost like using the digital as a useful interface to engage with the physical neurobiological stuff that's going on.
Yeah. What do you think about when you hear that, Luke? What comes to your mind?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. My mentor calls neurofeedback electronic yoga, because this is what the yogis will do. It's interesting to think about, because like to have these altered states of consciousness takes training, right? Often psychedelics are these beautiful thing, or plant medicines, but it's often like a shortcut. But meditators, they actually build those structures in the brain over years and years of training, so those structures are strengthened. And neurofeedback's doing the same thing. So yoga is in preparation for altered states of consciousness that are like in a healthy way for the individual. So neurofeedback is doing that same thing. It's that training. So you combine that training with plant medicines. I think we're like opening interesting doorways, and we're going interesting ways, interesting paths.
Yeah. Did you have something to add, Ollie?
I just wanted to ask what you found to be, you know, when you talk about plant medicines, do you find that there are some which have more potential to be used in combination with neurofeedback than others?
Well, I think we're still at the early stages. I think these are like questions we'll research more. I have a feeling as we go through this, the one thing I've mentioned to people is that we'll see different plant medicines may be effective for different things. Some might be good for PTSD, some might be good for head trauma. So it depends. I kind of have heard peripherally from people that the mushrooms and alpha theta might be a good protocol to do together.
Okay.
I met this woman. She's like the head of the NFL concussion program. That's what she works with as athletes. She goes,
Wow.
she looks at me and she goes, yeah, like I have PTSD. I do mushrooms and alpha theta. So she goes in these deep states on mushrooms.
Right.
And I have to talk to her again to see what kind of dose she uses. So right now it's a lot of like self-experimentation. And I know like modern 21st century, I don't know, I guess self-experimentation is kind of frowned upon. But if you look at the early 20th century and late 19th century, everyone did this. It was like Huxley, but also everyone else with mescaline. They're all self-experimenting back then, and that was considered good science to go out there and try it out and figure it out. So I think that we're in that stage again, in kind of this new area where like we got to try these things out and figure it out.
Yeah, it's interesting. Haven't you recently written 2 papers, Luke, on Huachuma and San Pedro? And what is different in those 2 substances versus ayahuasca when you're doing the neurofeedback?
Well, so we brain map both. And for the ayahuasca, we did pre maps and post brain maps, and in Huachuma, we did pre, during, and post. And how our brain mapping system works, which I think is really cool, it comes out of the field of neurofeedback. So it's basically been ignored by mainstream neuroscience, mainstream psychology, mainstream science in general. So how we look at the brain is different than them. So how a neurologist looks at the brain, they're looking at brain waves mostly to see like head trauma or epilepsy or patterns like this. But with QEEG brain mapping, as it's done by my mentor's company, New Mind Technologies, and other neurofeedback companies, we can see emotional state, right? So we can see like when trauma is in the system. And what I think we're seeing, which is most profound, is that plant medicines have a way of reducing trauma in the system. So a brain compartmentalizes trauma in certain ways. Some people have a busy mind, perseverance. Some people have ADD, disassociation. Some people worry. Some people worry about the future. Some people think of the past. These different mechanisms are ways, subconscious mechanisms for the brain to compartmentalize trauma. And so what we're seeing is both with ayahuasca and Huachuma that those ways, those trauma mechanisms are reducing in the system so that the brains are becoming more regulated. Now in the future, I think it'll take more time to see maybe the differences between the two, but both plant medicines, both ayahuasca and Huachuma, both seem to move in a healthy direction, move the brain. So an overactive brain will quiet. An underactive brain might gain more power, might speed up. Someone has a busy mind or someone has like ADD, that will become regulated. So both plant medicines seem to move the brain in a healthy direction, which I think is really cool because you think of a pharmaceutical drug, it just moves everyone in the same direction. And there's nothing really like this in the world except maybe adaptogens. So I think this is really going to give us a whole new model on trauma once this is widely understood. And this will give us a whole insight into healing, right? This will give us insight like how does healing happen? And then once we understand that, we'll be able to engage that mechanism much, much more effectively.
Yeah. For me, it brings up this question of, are there different, I don't know if this is possible, but when you look at brainwave activity, is there a difference between healing and optimization? You know what I mean? Because sometimes we get stuck in these words where like we want to be healed, but some people want to be optimized. And if you think of optimization, maybe you think of like an athlete that's trying to get to the next level, or a businessman that wants to conquer the world. Yeah. I don't know, but you know what I mean? Are those two things the same thing?
Yeah, no, I think they're definitely the same spectrum. I think they're definitely the same thing. So, for example, when there's trauma in the brain, there's a famous book called The Body Keeps the Score. It's about trauma in the body. And our body holds on to trauma physically. So, and there's trauma in the brain as well, physically. So you start healing the brain, everything starts coming online better. Their memory starts working better. Because the reason memory is not effective or not where it should be is because when trauma is in the system compartmentalizes, the brain compartmentalizes that trauma. And then since the memory uses so many different sections of the brain, memory affected. So it's all on the same spectrum. So as you heal, that's peak performance. And then there's no one ever really that's totally healed from trauma. It's always a thing you're kind of working on, unless you're like a lightened Buddha. But then, for example, say like with neurofeedback, like, okay, I've done a lot of work healing their trauma. Like, and what do they want to specialize in? Like, what do they really want to work on? So I can, like, if it's an athlete, I can train the motor cortex for them to be better in that way. There's some people that like train opera singers, for example, with neurofeedback. They just train that part of the brain. So it's all kind of part of a spectrum. But I would say as you heal trauma, that's going to help your performance. And then after that, you can start working specifically on where they want to go, even more so.
Ollie, what do you think about that? What's your take?
I mean, I think it's really fascinating. And, you know, when I think about the brainwave states, I'm drawn to these ideas of oscillations. And I was speaking to my friend who's a neuroscientist, and he's looking really deep into the actual sine waves within the oscillations to, you know, look at it on this micro level. And do you think there's something there where we can really fine tune the oscillations within a certain state and maybe reconceptualize how we're feeling or how we are or what's happening as a state, rather than I have depression, it's I'm experiencing a depressed state, or I am in an anxious state, and that's okay, and it's something you can work with, but it's not the defining characteristic. It's not necessarily you are not your thoughts. Your brainwave is in a state, and it needs to be more regulated. Do you think it can be, I guess, standardized, fine-tuned to this point where, you know, you will get that optimal result?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really powerful insight what you're saying, because I had that same insight. So when I had my first brain map, she goes, you have a pattern for PTSD, insomnia, and anxiety. That took this onus off me, like, oh, like something wrong with me, and like, oh, I have this brain pattern, I have this state, like you were saying. And my job was to train it, right? So it was hugely empowering for me. So then sometimes I'll do a brain map of someone, like, hey, you might have trouble focusing, you have that brain pattern. Like, oh, I thought that was just me. That's a brain pattern, you know? So it was so empowering for people to hear, like, no, that's not you. You're not your thoughts, like you said. Like, and you can change these things. And it gives people such a level of empowerment. And that's the really beautiful thing, because all this technology is to empower people. And then going into like the subtleties of the brainwaves, like, I think there's so much to explore and so much to learn. When you see brainwaves going across the screen, it's really like a Zen-like experience when you know what you're looking at, because this is literally the life force of you going across your screen, and within that, you see everything about a person. And the true genius in the field can look at your raw brainwaves and see everything about you. And it's something that it's like learning Sanskrit, learning your own language from the brain. So, yeah, I think we have so much to learn. I think there's lots of people interested in gamma waves, for example, and there's these little brain waves that ride other brain waves. And what do those mean? And some people, you know, those are associated like peak experiences and meditation. And some people say if you train these gamma waves, like we can train like energy healers can become more powerful, or psychics can become more powerful. We train gamma waves, you know? So we don't know where all this goes, but I think we're, it's definitely that peak potential. And then there's also like that empowerment that we're not our state. Like you said, we're not our thoughts, that we can train these things.
When I start hearing about that, I think of a tuning fork. And I think of that old analogy of like, we are the receivers and we radiate outwards on some level. And then I start thinking about, wow, it's interesting to hear about people sitting in ceremony together. And is this contagious? And we've all been around people that's like, wow, this person's fun to be around, or this person's like an energy vampire. You know, are these states that are going on in our mind, are we a tuning fork? Are we radiating outwards this energy and it's syncing up with other people's brains, and maybe we're getting on that next level with them? It seems like there's so much there.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly, there's so much to go in with that. But yeah, I think we are these tuning forks. One, I think there's a lot of people that say that our body, the physical, is a tuning fork for our consciousness. So we're like a receiver for consciousness itself. And then when we're in the physical, we're actually tuning in to other people. So, I think if you look at a shaman and like an apprentice, that shaman apprentice, their brainwaves are syncing. If you look at a whole room full of people, like their brainwaves are syncing, but their heart waves, their heart energy is probably syncing. And there's probably a quantum level we can't measure yet that's probably syncing up. And this idea of synchronicity and everything syncing up, I think it's for sure going on. I think I remember reading once that one person used to hook up married couples for marriage counseling and sync their brainwaves up. And they have these really powerful experiences because they're synced up, their brainwaves are synced up. So yeah, like what are the limits? What are the potentials of this? I don't think we even know yet. I think it's very interesting.
I remember you recently just mentioned adaptogens. And I remember a conversation I was having with someone where we were talking about adaptogens, nootropics, functional mushrooms, and wondering, okay, you've got loads of situations, whether it's a workplace situation or a family situation where there's disagreements or misunderstandings or things just aren't quite working properly. People aren't resonating. They're not vibing on the same level. The communication's really problematic. And we were wondering, hey, if you could get, a whole workplace using, the same dose of lion's mane or reishi or cordyceps, or a family doing that, would you be able to finely tune it, so that people are resonating on a similar level with something which has possibly less, potential for adverse effects, like psychedelics, something that you could maybe easily integrate a bit more in terms of predictability, I think. So wondering, I don't know, have you explored what's happening to people's brains when they're taking things like lion's mane, or is it more the psychedelics that are showing more promise at the moment?
Well, psychedelics have been my primary research because I'm in Peru. I kind of have free reign right down there. Actually, I'm in the States right now. I'm with my family for Thanksgiving and Christmas. But in Peru, I have free reign to research psychedelics. That's been my primary research. But I've actually researched other things like tobacco. People go on tobacco dietas. And I was kind of surprised because after 2 weeks of tobacco dieta, I saw really powerful changes in the brain in that as well. So as far as adaptogens, I love adaptogens. I think they're great. I think I could definitely see what you're talking about and the potential to that. And just from my insight, okay, what do adaptogens do? They really help out with stress, right? Like it helps the body, like in stressful situations, with physical stress or mental stress, helps that out. But say mental stress. If everyone's stress level is reduced and everyone can adapt in a certain way, they can adapt to each other in a much better way. They can adapt to social situations in a certain way, and they won't be operating out of like this stress response. So I think definitely, I think there's a lot of potential to what you're talking about.
Sometimes I wonder too, being where you're at, Luke, it seems to me that a lot of people come down there with leverage on themselves. You know what I mean by that? Like they're ready for change. And so they have made that change and now they're in this new environment. What role do you think or can you see those changes in brain waves when someone just moves into a new environment? That seems like a big part of it is if someone wants to break patterns, the first thing that they might want to do is find a brand new environment to be on.
No, I think that's huge. Just from my personal life, like being a veteran, like going to the jungle, living in the jungle before I even did ayahuasca was such a powerful experience. I remember when I first went down, I was 4 days in the jungle. I talked to this pre-facilitator, and I'm like, wow, this is great. This amazing experience. And then she gives me a little like wry smile. She goes, wait till you try ayahuasca, But look, really, just the experience of being down there is so powerful. I know many veterans that live in like foreign countries because like you can be closer to nature. You can live on a beach for a lot less expensive. You can live in the jungle. And for me, like just being in the country of Peru and like, especially the jungle surrounded by nature, like that is healing. And I haven't done research this myself. I know other people have. I think there's this book called like the 3-Day Experiment, where people go in nature for 3 days, and their brain is dramatically more relaxed because they're just in nature, you know. So I think environment is critical, and I think that especially Americans and Westerners, we live in these concrete jungles and cities and stuff. So whatever we can do to like change things up, or even bring in some plants inside and stuff like that, can be really powerful.
Yeah, I agree. What do you think? What's your thoughts on that, Ollie?
It's a really fascinating one because, you know, particularly with psychedelics, I've personally had a lot of experiences by myself, and at times the environment hasn't been so important. Depending on the nature of the experience, depending on the strength of the experience, it might just be something where I'm needing to really go within, and the external environment isn't that important. And actually, you know, there's other people around me that can maybe create, I don't know, an experience that might not be so pleasant depending on whatever the other person's going through. And I think as well, you know, it's great that you are in a place like Peru where you've got this freedom. I think in, you know, and the US as well, where there is more of that freedom, in a place like the UK where things aren't necessarily so ordained, things are really underground. It's difficult to find these kind of experiences. So a lot of it is doing it on your own without necessarily a whole lot of guidance or a lot of those spaces provided. And like the UK, I think, is the most concreted country in Europe. So, I mean, I'm quite fortunate. I live on the edge of a national park. And I've got that ability, literally, you know, not even 5 minutes walk. And I'm on beautiful downland with lots of views. And it's not the same for a lot of people in this country. There's a lot of people who are in quite difficult situations that, you know, they can't afford to go to somewhere like Peru or go to somewhere where it's allowed to take psychedelics. And on top of that, their environment is a concrete jungle, and there's all the other things going on, like systemic inequalities and stress and all of this going on. So it's, you know, I'm always intrigued as to how we can create more accessible experiences to, yeah, give people that respite, put people in different environments where, you know, it does create that change. I mean, I've never taken ayahuasca. I have been to Iquitos. When I was in South America, I was like, I just want to go to Iquitos and check out this city that's, you know, a million people in the middle of the Amazon. It's like insane. I just wanted to soak up a lot of the energy there. And like, I've never been somewhere where I've just got this buzz, like being on reserves or just meeting different people and really feeling this energy of ayahuasca, meeting so many people that are talking about ayahuasca. And I had a very different experience in Cusco where I took part in a San Pedro ceremony, and that it strangely kind of felt a bit like more like home. I was up on a mountain. The scenery was like, oh yeah, this kind of looks a bit like Scotland or Wales. There was this ruggedness about it that I resonated with, and it was actually, in a way, less of a powerful experience than being in the Amazon on no psychedelics. After that San Pedro experience, I felt a little bit, I wouldn't say cheated, but I felt a little bit like, oh, that was, you know, that was so gentle. It was so calm. I was on a mountain. It kind of felt like I was in Scotland, you know. And then afterwards, the integration of it turns out it was one of the most profound, beautiful experiences of my life. But yeah, just being in the Amazon, it's wild. Being on the Amazon River, going to see pink river dolphins and just sitting on a boat, you're not moving, you're just taking in that stillness, and you catch a glimpse of this, you know, pink thing going to the water, and you're like, wow, what was that? And you realize it is this place of magic. And I can't imagine, heard so many stories, and so many people I know tell me about especially the audible experience of being in the Amazon under the influence of ayahuasca. If you've never been in a jungle, if you come from a city and then you go to the Amazon and you've got all these insects and creatures that you've never heard before. It must be. I mean, I've lived on farms in Tasmania where, you know, I'm on maybe like smoked a bit of weed and there's all the different things going off, all the frogs, all the different insects. I'm like, this is wild, you know. So yeah, it's a really special place. And I find that with like the UK, with a lot of the pagan sites and standing stones and ley lines and areas of significance, you pick up that energetic resonance. Again, you know, it's coming back to this idea of resonance, I think, which is really important.
Yeah, I love that. It's in some ways it makes me think of this other question that I had written out here, and since I have both of you experts with me here, I'm curious to get your guys' opinion on this one. Fungi embody principles of interconnection and resource sharing. How do these natural principles challenge the philosophical concept of individualism in human society? Anyone want to take that one first?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I'm thinking about on a daily basis, and I'm currently collaborating. Shout out to Mycelium Hub in Sweden. They're a really interesting group of people that I've just started talking to, but they're looking at principles of mycelial interconnectedness and how that can help people, I guess, who have been in the corporate space for a long time and feeling burnt out and feeling a lack of purpose, have put all of their time and energy into working whatever 70-hour weeks for a lot of money, and realizing that way of doing things hasn't necessarily, you know, been the end goal, and they're looking for other ways to connect. And, you know, I think if we can find ways to replicate what's going on in nature, this idea, as you said, resource sharing, even when you've got two different species of fungi in nature, it's not competition in the same way that we think of competition. It's not trying to get one over on the other. It's, you know, this acknowledgement and respect. Hey, okay, you can take those resources there, I'll take these there, but we're all a part of the forest. It's not this top-down way of doing things. It's not a CEO coming into a boardroom saying, I've got these targets and you've got to hit these targets by the second quarter, and, you know, if you don't, everyone's fired. It's like a mushroom would probably laugh at that way of doing things, I think.
Yeah. Luke, did you find when you initially went down to Peru, did you find not only the act of moving into a new location that was geographically much more diverse than you were used to, but also the culture of like, this is how things are done here? Did you find that to be something that was healing?
Yeah. So like, there's like in Western culture, we have like this sense of control where everything has to be controlled, and down there that's not so much of a big deal. It's kind of, everyone's kind of going with the flow, and life just kind of happens. And, you know, for a lot of Westerners, that can be really challenging at first, you know, because maybe things won't get done when they want to get done and things like that.
Oh yeah, try getting a bus in Bolivia.
yeah. But yeah, I really appreciate how, like, how things are done differently. You know, we always have a thing that our way is the best way, but there's other ways too, and I really appreciate, like, so sometimes I go and I drive around my motorcycle in the mountains, and I'll see some Peruvians. They'll wave me down, and they have what they call chicha. It's like a corn drink, an alcoholic corn drink. They make from corn. They invite me over, and like around noon, they all start drinking chicha while they're working. So they're kind of just drinking, and things start slowing down. I'm not sure how much work it's done, but I go sit talk to them for half an hour. Like what kind of crops they're growing, and I just kind of sit around and look at this, like, wow, this is not bad life, you know. Like, I'm always like rushing around doing stuff all the time, but they're always very much in the present. So I really enjoy that.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing to me to think. You know what kind of gets me going down this road of is this idea of why we have trauma in the first place. And sometimes, especially, this is a great question. I've heard you talk about this earlier, Ollie, in a previous talk. When we look at so much of the psychedelics, at least where I'm looking at, it seems that the military veterans are at the forefront, like PTSD, heroic hearts. There's all these veterans groups that are finding ways to deal with trauma. My friend Doc Askins wrote a book called The Anti-Hero's Journey, and he talks about things that happen to them. But there does seem to be sort of a lack of talk about anti-war in the world of the veterans groups. I heard you speak about this, Ollie, and I would love, maybe you could introduce that, Ollie, and then I could get your response on that, Luke, just to see what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Ollie.
I mean, thanks for the question. I think I want to caveat this by saying that, obviously there is a serious issue going on with veterans committing suicide when you look at the statistics of people killed in active combat versus, killing themselves. It's horrendous what's going on, and we need ways to help people. I think with everything, with any desperate situation, health situation, we need ways to help people. And for me, I really do see the benefit of MDMA, particularly in helping with PTSD. I know people that were practitioners, underground practitioners in the 80s, who were treating veterans from the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and there's a real lot of promise. But for me, I guess the difficult thing is when the narrative gets spoken about in terms of this net zero trauma, which is an acceptance that, okay, we can't get rid of the sources of trauma like war, so we just have to find ways to mitigate them. And I suppose the psychedelic hippie idealist within me is still hammering home this point of like, hey, come on, togetherness, oneness, love and peace. Like, what's going on? When I sat and had psychedelic experiences and thought about, I'm in a very peaceful country relatively, in the UK, and I think I try and kind of meditate on being in a war situation, and it's impossible. It's impossible to even conceive of a bomb dropping on your house. It's impossible to think of being in combat. It's like I can't, my mind can't get there. So for me, it just naturally draws towards, so this is horrendous. How do we stop it?
Yeah, I think it's a huge topic, right? War. Why do human beings engage in war? What is this all about? I think there's a massive political component to it. I think the modern mind has a way of blocking it out and don't think about what's going on. I think the United States, if you look at post World War II, let's just start there. Before that we had a Department of War, and now we have a Department of Defense. But I think by any kind of stretch of imagination, we're more at war anywhere in the world, and it's supposed to be like a defensive thing, right? So we have these illusions and games we play with ourselves to deny that reality of war even really happening or existing. And I think most people at some level know there's a problem with veterans, but it feels very far away because I think the veteran population is fairly small. I mean, might be bigger.
Yeah, I don't know any veterans. I had this conversation probably for the first time with some people in the psychedelic space, and I was like, do you guys actually know any, like, the people we're connected to in the US, but in the UK, I was like, do you guys actually know any veterans? I can't find anyone I know who knows any veterans in the UK.
Yeah, I know. And I think I met someone from Canada. They said the same thing. Like, you're the first veteran I met, and so it's for in the United States, for example, there's a few states that contribute the most military manpower to all four branches, so often those states might have that idea in the community, but most states don't, and they're in large military bases. So the general population has a whole lot of interaction with that, and then people come back with PTSD. It's often natural with any kind of trauma to isolate, so they'll isolate and not be around people, and then just like everything in Western society, like our denial of death, death is always kept very far away at a hospital and things like that. Same thing with war, like the American war machines all around the world doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And the average person has no clue about it. And just like you're talking about, like trying to imagine a bomb dropping in your house or trying to imagine a war situation, most Americans, unfortunately, never even try to figure that out. It's just something on a screen, like a video game, and they can I think it's really sad because it, like in ancient cultures, war happened, but it was very visceral, and no one could really deny it when it was happening. But and today, like we have this denial of it, and yeah, I guess that's part of the question. I'm not even sure how we, like I said, this problem of war. I think it's something we definitely should talk about and work on. I look at it as very much a spiritual sickness when we have these wars going on and no one like talks about it. Kind of just the same thing with like the opioid epidemic, right? Like we have these huge crises happening, and the media like totally distracts us with something that's relatively irrelevant compared to war. I think the war is the most important issue of our age, and no one even realizes that. So I'll say few people actually think about it like you think about it. Think about what it means. I mean, really, people should think about what it means for a bomb to drop on their house, and then you think of like American drone pilots dropping bombs on wedding parties in some far off country, or even just having drones flying over country on a daily basis, dropping bombs. Like, how would that make an American feel if that was happening to his country? I think those are important things to think about.
Yeah. I think so many of us wish that things could change in like a leap of faith, but it's more like a slow unraveling. You know what I mean? Like we're slowly sort of waking up with like one eye, like this is painful, man. I'm just gonna go back to sleep. What about Billy the water skiing squirrel over here? Let's look at that for a minute. That's a little bit nicer, But I think that perhaps like what we saw in the 60s, if past relevant behavior is the best predictor of future behavior, people beginning to wake up and be like, you know what? I don't think we should do this anymore. Wait, you know what? Like I have a lot of friends that are committing suicide. You know what? This ruined my relationship. You know what? This ruined my kid's life, or so-and-so just committed suicide. Like when it gets to this level where you can't ignore it anymore, that seems to be a time when people at the top get pretty nervous. They're like, let's put this thing back, man. Let's get this genie back in the bottle. We got this guy, Luke, putting documentaries out. He's got this EEG machine. He's doing brain patterns. We got Ollie in the UK speaking about this. Like, do you think that this sort of waking up is something that can cause people in positions of authority, like insurance executives, politicians, to become more nervous and start wanting to put psychedelics back in the bottle?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have personally been reprimanded over LinkedIn from certain people for being too vocal, for commenting on people's posts, and particularly with the Israel-Gaza situation, and it was a thing where I was like, very quickly, okay, I have to learn where the right audience is and understand that there's a lot of people in, certainly in the UK, where we have these power structures related to like the landed gentry, aristocracy, royal family that is in ties with British colonialism and the army and all of that stuff, where we have a lot of wealthy landowners. Like 1% of the landowners in the UK own 50% of the land. So it's like when you start to talk about these things, starting to talk about things which challenge certain power structures which people are connected to, people do get nervous, and people, I see a lot of gleeful talk about psychedelics in the UK, and critical inquiry can sometimes not be welcome in certain circles, particularly where we have got such an establishment, whatever you want to call it, ruling class, this, this social class system that's so heavily entrenched. People often feel like you're ruffling feathers too much. And there's a lot of self-censorship that happens in the UK. We get really worried, really nervous about saying the wrong thing, upsetting the wrong kind of people, having whatever opportunities taken away. And, some people just want to still have their seat at the table, which is fair enough. And I guess, for me personally, I've existed somewhat on the fringes and been a bit of a renegade, I guess. Me and a couple of friends, we started a psychedelic society at our university before there were any student psychedelic societies. So there was, there's always this sense of like, hey, come on, we've got to press whatever the issue is. And now that psychedelics have become more normalized and mainstream, okay, what are the pressing issues within this normalized paradigm? It is actually how, we look at these ideas of oneness and togetherness that everyone espouses. And ultimately, if it makes some people feel uncomfortable, I think possibly it's gone too far to maybe put the genie back in the bottle, but certainly it's being regulated in certain ways. There's certain ways of accessing things that people would prefer, so we have, for example, the organization Psilocybin Access Rights in the UK. It's not called Magic Mushroom Access Rights. So there's certain narratives and certain ways that people want to steer things in order to understand how we're going to access them. And if you rock the boat too much, I went along to like a swanky event with Paul Stamets, and I started talking about mushrooms and aliens, and people were like, what? So
I would love to hear about that.
Me too.
Yeah. I mean, that's maybe a conversation for another time, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that, there's always been power structures throughout history, right? And I think if you look at there's a cycle of civilizations where that power structure starts becoming corrupt, decadent, and non-responsive to the people. And the people are like, hey, this is an interesting thing. Something's going on here. And it's very easy for even if you look at 1984 and the Brave New World, give people soma, right? And which might be alcohol and sports and things like this. If you take a psychedelic and wait, you start wondering things. I remember one time I took one and what are these things called mortgages? It's ridiculous. Why would I pay this much money for when, pay to a bank? It's a thought, but you start thinking about this is kind of ridiculous, what's going on here? And enough people start thinking about that, and the power structure might start getting really worried, when people stop paying their taxes, or because it's a small minority ruling over a much larger majority, and in the end, all their power is really illusion. It's really the masters of illusion, where they trick us with different kinds of methods, and we talk about thoughts, some things are allowed to say and some things are not allowed to say. So we self-censor ourselves because they have this illusion of power, and we even have a sense of things we're not supposed to say. Think about that, right? Think about that power structure where we're self-censoring what we're saying in our thoughts. Wow, that's a lot of power. And I think that some people might even go to conspiracy theories. This is a thing that's developed over a long time. But I think we just look at this, I didn't even need that. This is something it's not healthy for us to be able to not speak our minds. And I think that the more we do empowers us. And for people that wonder, I think the power system is very, very concerned. It has been for a long time. If you look at J. Edgar Hoover, he was wiretapping everybody, the head of the FBI in the United States. There's no one he didn't try to observe and see what they're doing. It's extreme paranoia what the masses are doing, and for them anti-war activists and civil rights leaders. And I think that same paranoia exists in the power structure today, and there's a constant effort to divert people's attention to things that they can control, right? So
I find that sorry, go again.
Just the last thing. So say for the abortion issue in the United States, and I'm not really saying one thing or another, but if you have everyone focused on that issue, you might not be watching what the CIA is doing in this country, and the bombs are dropping here, which they're okay with that, right? They don't want you to know about that issue, right? So when the media is talking, always be thinking of what they're not talking about. That's what I try to do.
Yeah, it's a great point. What were you going to say, Ollie?
I mean, I think, just going on from your point about power structures and control, and I think it's interesting to see where psychedelic culture has gone, and certainly in terms of, my personal interest into psychedelics was through music, was through the kind of, that hippie culture that is a
Yeah.
bit out there and quite creative and not necessarily that controlled. And now it feels like the overwhelming focus is on psychedelic science or therapeutic applications, or speaking in quite limited terms, and almost like psychedelics have been disarmed somewhat. It's almost like they're a little bit boring, they're a little bit lame. You've now got DARPA talking about, can we create psychedelics that don't give people a bad trip? And it's like, people I know saying like, well, bad trips can be really useful. It's really useful moments that teach you a lot and help you understand your mind and give you that real power over your mind, is having that difficult experience. And if we want to just carefully control and make it all nice and fluffy and marketable into a product, and I feel like it's going to just get really dangerous. And there'll be some snapback. There'll be some, I don't know, spirit of the psychedelics will come back and bite people in the arse, maybe.
Yeah,
No,
I see it.
I think it's so key what you're saying. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Carry on.
Yeah, just that whole thought, like, I forget sometimes because I'm in Peru most of the time, and I'm in the jungle doing like ayahuasca with the shaman. I forget, like, people talk about like, yeah, we'll just put this thing in a pill and then like don't have a bad trip. I'm like, whoa, like this is wild. Like, I mean, I think it takes away the whole essence of it, because like, especially shamanism, right? Like, you are going to be like, part of psychedelics and shamanism, especially, you will be challenged. That is part of the experience. You will be challenged. And by far, some of my best experiences have been my most challenging, because that's when you learn about yourself the most. And I think some of it's just the Western culture. We want to put a thing in a little pill. You just take it. I mean, they might even want to put like the compound in the pill so there's no psychedelic effect, just so you can supposedly heal from it. This really misses the point of healing at a spiritual level, because healing at a spiritual level, at least especially a shamanic level, you have to face your demons, you have to face your challenges. You might have to face sides about yourself that you do not like. And if the Western model tries to avoid that, then the healing won't take place.
That's all the Western model does, is try to avoid that. Like, they're like, we would like the psychedelic experience, but without any of the negative kind of things. Like, have you guys seen some of the research where they're trying to take like the difficult parts of the trip out of the pill? Like, you have people studying this to like, we want the transformative effects, but we're not so much interested in the hallucinogenic effects. Can we figure this out? And you have people spending millions of dollars on this. And I remember researching it and being like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, you can't separate these two things. But I guess on the underlying part of it, they're like, well, what about people that are, that are on their deathbed, or maybe that's not even the excuse. Like, it just seems absurd to me to try and eliminate the difficult part of the trip out of the trip. Like, that's like saying, I want to have the ability to grow without any trauma. Can you fix that for me? And then you start looking at like nepotism and our leadership and how that kind of echoes. Like, I was going to put my kid involved over there. Like, in some ways, it echoes the world that we live in. And maybe you could say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Like, we don't want people to get hurt. We want them to have the best possible life without getting hurt. But when you try to nerf everything and protect people, you're really limiting who they can be. You're really limiting them from fighting their demons and seeing their potential and moving forward. On the topic of where psychedelics are today, I want to give you my thoughts and then hear what you guys have to say. I feel like we're in the late 50s, early 60s. Like, this thing is trying desperately to be contained in this medical container. And there's some people that are like, man, if we can wrap our arms around it, centralize it, we can make a lot of money, man. This will be awesome. But you already see like the birth of the new merry pranksters with people like Dennis Walker coming out and like making these Instagram accounts and blowing up to like 10,000 people and then getting shut down, coming back, getting 5,000, 8,000. Like, there is this culture emerging out of it. And I think that maybe in the next 10 years, it's not obtuse to think that maybe you have these day-glow Tesla school buses rolling around with new electric Kool-Aid acid tests happening. And you already see the protests on college campuses. Like it's already bursting at the seams. I don't know. Is that too far out? What do you guys think about this world of psychedelics getting to blow up into a 60s style sort of creative experience?
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed it being a psychedelic musician in the UK, being in the, I guess the wider genre of psychedelic rock, which is one of the, you know, massive growing genres in the UK at the moment. There's there's a franchise going around called Psychfest, which takes place in different cities. So there's this explosion, and there's a crossover happening of the heavy metal scene with the psych scene. So there's people getting into psychedelics in a cultural sense, in something of like a visceral sense. You know, the festival scene is quite big in the UK, and I think that has come hand in hand with the academic stuff, but maybe through kind of like convergent thinking. Because I said earlier, there's not necessarily those people that I meet in the music scene that are also going to psychedelic conferences, but you know, I know a lot of people who are trippers, who are heads, you know, that are very much into their psychedelics, and almost like the trickle down legitimization that has happened, I think has had some useful effect, whilst also kind of pigeonholing the research into science. It's also helped like people to have more conversations with their families, and I can quite comfortably talk to my family, be like, yeah, I'm in a psychedelic rock band, you know, and it's like, cool, you know. Yeah, what are your thoughts, Luke?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of moving parts to it, right? So in Peru, I tried ayahuasca for the first time like over 10 years ago, and I was 28 at the time. I was like one of the oldest people in the group, and it was all like young adventurers that were going down. And now we have like doctors and lawyers and you know people and the like looking for meaning. It's much more widespread now. So I think it's a good thing because more people have access to it, but it's also kind of like people are often not engaging with it in the same way. So now we have, like before I went down, like you kind of just were on your own. You had to figure things out. Now you have these huge ayahuasca retreats. They're like luxury resorts, and people almost look at it as kind of like I'm going on vacation. I'm gonna do this thing, and it's kind of like I've tried this like, I don't know what you would call it, but it's kind of lifestyle choice, right? Instead of like I'm going down to be like challenged with something that like no one even knows about, right? Because no one even knew about it hardly when I went down, and now you hear it in pop culture a lot. So I think you kind of have this tension between two different things that are happening at the same time. At the same time, you have this legal fight for it to happening, but it's been very much put in the psychological model and the mental health model, which I think has its legitimacy, but it's taken away from the real shamanic model and traditional model and tribal model like our ancestors would have it. So you put it in the mental health model and psychologize it, I think we're missing out on the true nature of shamanism, the true nature of consciousness, because we're more than psychological beings. We're also spiritual beings. And for me, plant medicines and shamanism is so intertwined for me that I've seen such amazing things and amazing change, and really the magic of the world like comes to life, like completely like all the universe comes alive. And I think it's a lot different thing. Like, oh, this guy's gonna take mushrooms for his trauma. You know, like our ancestors didn't even think of trauma in that way. And I think we be careful how we, from my perspective, I like keeping that traditional way of doing things. And I think I think there's this tendency because the modern culture psychologizes everything. It's just kind of how it's done. But I think we all keep in like that spiritual aspect, the magical aspect, and realize we don't know everything, realize that we don't know the answers. So I see these tensions on both sides, but I'm really hopeful, and I'm really excited about the future because I think I think it will continue that way. I think you'll have the one side that medicalizes it, and the other side that's kind of like the artists and the people that are doing mushrooms in their lawn looking for UFOs and like doing it for adventure. I mean, I think we have to have like that open heart and that mind of children, and realize like this universe is so beautiful, and we have to go into it in that, with that kind of, the lightness of heart. I think it's the best way to describe it.
It's a really interesting point, because often I've found myself grappling with ideas of psychedelic gatekeeping, and where, you said the way in which people are engaging with it, it doesn't feel like they're engaging with it in these ways which honor the traditional aspects of psychedelics. And then, it's this whole thing of does everyone need to take psychedelics? Does everyone need to actually have this direct experience in order to have that healing? If on like a societal level, could there be enough of us taking psychedelics that it tips the scales and then changes these different structures? And it seems like it's very much this capitalist way of like, no, I've got to go and do it. I don't believe you unless I've had it. And it's, funny when you mentioned it, like a holiday. When I was in Iquitos, and I was at a hostel, and someone literally just off a list, we're going to a reserve for 3 nights, then we're going to see the river dolphins, and then we're going to take ayahuasca. And I was like, and they were, they're like early 20s, and I was like, oh, okay, cool. I was like, have you taken ayahuasca before? They're like, no. I was like, brilliant. I hope you have a beautiful experience. But yeah, it didn't seem this like, I'm going to take ayahuasca and, it's going to be, it was just like, let's go. I'm like, fucking hell, all right. More, well, go for it. But, and that's the thing. It's like, I don't want to get into that, because you get into that and then you start to become judgmental. You get into ego state where you're just like, do you not know the veracity of the experience you're about to undertake, little girl? And it's like, whoa, you need to really check that stuff and be like, people are going to have the experiences they're going to have. And ultimately, when I've been interacting with some people from the corporate space, you kind of have corporate burnout. It's like they see the magic, they see that spark and they're like, oh, what is that? I really want some of that. And maybe historically, I guess like hippie subculture is just like, whatever, square, go away in your suit. And that's not useful, because it just creates more division. And it's like, as you said, how can we come at it with that open heart? For me, the Huachuma experience was so profound because it was that heart opening experience that allowed me to be less cynical and realize that, if you've been in the world of finance for 30 years, that's not you. That's the thing that you've been told that you need to do. And actually your spirit is this like holy, amazing, wonderful thing that needs to be nurtured. And, doing stuff like inner child work and coming at situations where it's like, hey, if I was, the inner child within me is meeting the inner child within you, that kind of egoless expression where you just want to connect. It's almost like that pre-egoic state where you see, like 4-year-old kids and they're like, hey, you're a kid, I'm a kid, let's be kids and play. And we really do forget that, because we've got to be serious adults doing the things, paying the mortgages, all this stuff. And, the beauty of psychedelics is that wonder, that connection. And if we can bring other people into that wonder and connection, then it's like, come on, let's get everyone on board. And then hopefully it's like the people who have a lot of influence and ability to make change and resources, like let's get them on board as well. And hopefully it will kind of expand. Yeah.
In some ways, it sounds like a giant rite of passage ceremony. You know what I mean by that? It seems like we spoke about adaptogens earlier, but perhaps the people that find themselves called to psychedelics through whatever means become changed in a way, and then they become the catalyst for change for everybody else. You know what I mean? And like, if you just look at it as sort of this ritualistic that happens every maybe 100 years or something like that, we do have this significant group of baby boomers that are this giant generation that are dying in a way that's kind of unprecedented. Like, there's such a large group of baby boomers, you could argue that so much of the trauma that's happening are the unrealized dreams of these people dying, just scratching for one more term in office. You know, if I can just get this part right passed, man, I will fulfill my destiny. And then you have this younger generation. It's like, I don't care about any of that. That's stupid. Why are we funding your stuff? Like, haven't you guys done enough? And it's sort of this tension between these generations that's happening. And I can't help but think the absence of rituals and rites of passage is something that's been gutted from at least the Western world. Like, you know, when I hear Luke talk about some of these ceremonies, like I find it like, wow, I wonder what it's like to watch the elder pass down knowledge to somebody else in this ritual ceremonial setting. And we have so many people it seems to me that in the Western world, we have people that are refusing to pass down information. Like, that's a recipe for war and destruction, right? Could it be a ritual ceremony on a bigger level that we're going through, this rite of passage maybe, or is that too grand of an idea?
Yeah, I think rites of passage are huge. I think it was like the first time in history we ever had them. I think it's extremely damaging in so many ways, because we all fundamentally need that. I think like people often will do it in the wrong ways. You know, I mean, I think I went to the military for my own rite of passage, and it was what it was. But I think you can often like get into like real destructive behaviors to try to like, so you haven't had this rite of passage. And so I think you look at your ancient traditions, they always had this rite of passage. And I think it's interesting because you're talking about like how do like changes happen and kind of small group change to bigger group. I'm reminded of a story I read. I forget which book, but all these women took LSD. They're like East Coast establishment women, and they took LSD and they realized they want to stop the Vietnam War in the 60s. So their goal was, this group of women was to marry like powerful politicians and generals and get them to try LSD, so they would wake up to the follies of Vietnam. And you have this idea, we can just get this out there to the right people, we can do it. And you talk about like, well, you know, if enough people do this, do we need everybody? I don't think we need everybody. And in fact, I don't think everyone should do these things. I always say people should be called to it. And the person in the jungle that was just kind of try it like on a tour, I'm like, well, you know, like this person might be really challenged. And if you're not prepared mentally for that, they can be, you know, a lot of, you know, they can have like big challenges. And I know people that prepare for it the most, like a year. I've met people that prepare for a year for the first ayahuasca, and they get some of the most things out of it. And this kind of going on to the same thing. The Temple of Lucis in Greece was around for 1,000 years. And we're not sure what the ceremony was, but there's some kind of psychedelic event. But anyone knows anyone in the ancient world went there to do it. So like Cicero and Plato. And so it gives you a whole insight. You know, like I think of like these historians that write about the ancient world, but have no clue that all these people had a psychedelic experience. And that gives you a whole different insight into that world and who these people were. And if that historian has never had a psychedelic experience, he's missing a whole big thing of what happened. And yeah, I think this culture and this immersion, I think, is very fascinating.
What's your thoughts on that, Ollie?
Yeah, I mean, I've been getting into this this stuff a bit. It's such a kind of complicated thing, you know. I think a lot in terms of this country in the UK, where, you know, the sense of indigenous connection to the land is quite tenuous, and we've had, you know, the Romans, the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons, all these different cultures come in, and then we've had a royal family that has, you know, taken away the land and prevented access to, you know, sacred sites in this country. So we really lack a rite of passage. I think it's why the UK might historically have so many problems with drugs and alcohol and violence, and this need to establish itself. And, you know, there's a lot of men in this country who have a lot of anger and emotional problems and real problems with alcohol and drugs. And, you know, I've met men who have real kind of issues with absent fathers and have found, like, you know, getting into gang violence or just general, you know, getting to street fights and this kind of thing, it does become a rite of passage. And I see a lot of those types of men ending up in men's circles where they're looking for that spiritual connection, where they're looking for something which is in line with nature, because they're realizing that like this whole thing of being a man, the macho bravado, that's not it. That's, they're looking for something that is like that. And we really lack that. And I think I'm seeing more of these types of people entering into the psychedelic space who come from quite tough, macho backgrounds, where the rite of passage might have been going to something like the army or joining a boxing gym or something like this to prove themselves as a man. And I think it's, there are ways in which we can do the rites of passage which aren't necessarily about like proving yourself as a man, but actually about engaging with the land and honoring it, and then in doing so you respect it, and hopefully then you create better systems which work for everyone, because you've all had this initiation into something, whatever it is.
It's interesting that you bring up go ahead, Luke.
No, I was just saying that's kind of what I tell people too, like, hey, come challenge yourself with. So we have a retreat, we have martial arts, we have hiking. Like, come challenge yourself with ayahuasca and a hike in the Andes Mountains. And, like, this is a way to like healthily challenge yourself instead of like drugs or gangs or different things where people can get into. And I think, boxing and the military are probably the healthier some of the things they can get into. I mean, but yeah, like really, if you have a spiritual challenge, most initiations traditionally were a spiritual challenge where you become part of that group, part of the tribe, part of the community. Like you're reborn into a full being as an adult, as a man or woman, throughout the initiation of the transformation process. So it's something to think about importantly, that we need that. I agree. So,
when I think about initiation, I think about storytelling, and like, you can look back at, choose your mythology of the hero's journey, or, the sirens calling Odysseus to the rocks, or Luke Skywalker, whatever your story might be. There's these great stories that have happened throughout time. And it seems that we're at a time where storytelling has turned into story selling. And when I think about like all that narrative out there, it's like a profound lack of meaning and purpose. And of course there's going to be anger. If you're doing something that's meaningless or purposeless, like, if I worked at a job for 26 years and when I got to the top of the corporate ladder, I realized I was against the wrong wall. What do? I look over the wall and I'm like, this is bullshit. This is not what it was said. There's the meaning, there's the purpose. And when you lose that, now you're talking about losing identity. Like, what now? You really need that spiritual nature. Then you're searching, like, holy cow, man, I'm in a crisis right now. Like, you're at this particular age. Where do I find it? Like, I feel like that on some level is what psychedelics can be about. And if people can learn that through psychedelics at an earlier age to find purpose and meaning in life, we're way ahead of the game. Like, I feel like we're in a crisis of meaning and story, lack of stories. Like, what do you think, Luke? Like, you've had one foot in both worlds, like living in this story of the Western world and then moving down and participating in the story of transformation. But how does that, what I said, resonate with you?
Well, I think it's a really great insight. I have so many things to say on that. If you look at ancient traditions like the gods, Odysseus, like these are stories to emulate and to model ourselves after. They gave us a firm idea of like who we were, and those stories reach out to the past because those stories were told for generations that linked us from our ancestors to the present. So it gave us a huge identity of who we are. These stories gave us identity. These stories, and now we have like mass culture, popular culture, which totally just takes away those stories. And also I think it makes us easy to control. When we don't have a story, don't have a background, we're just kind of consumers. The power structure, it's much easier to control people that don't know their people or who they are. I think the power of story is just so important to existence. I have more things I was going to say, but I forget. But yeah, I think it's a really great point.
Yeah, the crisis in narration, Ollie. What do you think?
I mean, that's I've been speaking to people more in terms of, doing psychedelics with a view to honoring ancestors, to honoring that story, to finding that link. And, I found personally, when I am going through a challenging experience and I might be emotional, there might be floods of tears. Sometimes I wonder, well, is that necessarily my trauma? Is it trauma from my family or the ancestors or the land or whatever it is? And finding a way to weave my experience into a wider narrative, into a story, then it allows that sense of belonging. It allows that sense of safety, almost, that like you are held by the wider narrative, you are held by the ancestors and the spirits. It allows you to then connect with the land. It's, there's people I know that have a favorite tree, and they go and they sit with their favorite tree, and it's like these ways of conceptualizing where we actually are, weaving ourselves into this wider tapestry, I think just makes us nicer people. It makes us it makes us step out of ourselves. We're less wound up energetically. We're actually expanding ourselves. We're tapping into the like ancestral world wide web. Probably, it's like that's probably what the mycelium are doing. The mycelium are tapping us into this wider narrative. And for me, it hammers home that point of this oneness, of it is all you, this intersubjective experience of the one cosmos, and then honoring that. Again, it just allows me to be a lighter person, having a softer ego, being able to engage with anyone and everyone, and that's where I find like the benefit of psychedelics. And then it, as you say, Luke, it's like you aren't so easily controlled, because you're not lost. You're not like, oh, well, if I, fill my life with XYZ of all the things that are, preordained by the capitalist society, then everything's fine. And actually, if you can weave that narrative of like, hey, what's the significance of this, 150-year-old oak tree or something like that, that's been here and it's seen all of these things and it's still here. Like, what's the significance of the resilience? What can we learn from these different aspects of that tapestry? And like, I'm very jealous of the Aboriginal educational system in Australia, where it looks at things in this Aboriginal dream time. It's like you're telling a story, and through that story you're gaining so much knowledge. It's not this didactic sitting in a classroom, oh, I know that because the teacher told me so. It's more, I know this because I am woven into the tapestry of the ancestors. And if I engage with the plant and fungal medicines, that is the technological interface by which I can talk to the ancestors and find that belonging.
Yeah, I think story has like this, it's the most powerful way to communicate anything in the human consciousness. We're designed for story. Oral communication, this was done for millennia upon millennia before the written word. So there's something in us, like that's the most powerful way to transmit information is through a story. It's the most powerful way. And I remember I was going to say too, is about talk about these stories have these deep archetypes inside of us. And Carl Jung really revolutionized our thought when we think about this. So these stories reoccur over and over again, the hero's journey and these myths, like these idea of myth. We have no idea where myths come from. And we kind of use it as like as an ad hominem today, it's a myth, but like myth with a capital M, like they're deep structures to who we are. And you mentioned Star Wars, I kind of chuckle because I think Star Wars used the archetypes. The original Star Wars movies used the archetypes very effectively, and it resonated with people. And then when modern media or modern Hollywood deviates from those archetypes, then those movies flop and people are like, what the heck is that? But if you stick with those archetypes, even a new model, even a new story, it resonates with the human soul. It resonates with who we are. And I think Star Wars is actually a really good example of that. So,
yeah, Yeah, I think it speaks to the idea of mysticism too. You know, when you sit under an old tree and you begin to imagine how long that tree has been there, what it's seen, the lessons it's learned, you can almost begin to learn the lessons from that tree. You think about,
Mm.
whoa, I bet you this has had some drought. I wonder what it did. Well, it obviously survived. How did it survive? What are these other plants around there? Like you start seeing the story unfold in front of you in ways that are just earth shattering. It's almost like there's this bigger language desperately trying to communicate to us. And I can't help but when I talk to both of you guys, get this sort of admiration for the mystic tradition. And I know that you both have your own relationship with it. And I thought maybe we could talk about that a little bit. Ollie, let's start with you. You've got a background in mysticism. What do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's, you know, really interesting in terms of like the mystical connection and with that spirit, I guess. I've studied a little bit of Gnosticism, and I mean, I come from a Jewish background, and I've recently been reading some stuff connected to Judaism, which is more similar to the Gnostic traditions of this idea of the godliness within. You know, the when we talk about the entheogenesis, it's not just you are taking something and experiencing God, but actually you are bringing the godliness into the situation. And you know, some of the traditional prayers in Judaism where you're blessing the bread or blessing the candles, and the English translation might say thank you God. It's actually, you know, the Hebrew is more about, is like, blessed be the godliness of the situation that is occurring right now. And actually the eminence, you know, as you were talking about that tree, you know, I was picturing it. I was thinking, I was really visually just like, yeah, I was there, you know, in the English countryside, just sitting under an oak tree. And with these kind of experiences, which can be infused, you know, more powerfully with plant medicines, it does hammer home that engaging with the spirit that's infused with it. You know, I've explored the Shinto traditions, which are really like, it's not just like general spirit, but it's like there's the oak tree spirit, there's the river spirit, there's the little forest spirits, then there's the grand spirit of the forest, which is like the overarching spirit, and these really useful ways of engaging with it and honoring it, which I think are really powerful.
They are powerful. It begins to think about the ideas of before I gotta go off on some other rant. Let me push it over to Luke here. Like you have an incredible relationship with shamanic learning and being around shamanism and the mystic tradition. Like, what do you think about when we start talking about the word mysticism and mystical?
Well, I think there's so many good points to bring, like the Shinto tradition, this idea that everything's alive around you, and animism. This is the natural state for human beings through forever, that the river has consciousness, that the trees have consciousness, that there's elementals and spirits all around us. And with the modern mind, we kind of dismiss that. But if everyone believed that all around the world for all of history, is that so ridiculous? You know? And maybe there's a lot more to that than we think. And, you know, I'm from a Northern European background, so I'm really into the runes and the old gods. And the runes mean mystery. They mean esoteric. They mean a secret knowledge. And when you study these runes, like there's so much to them, you know, like, and the idea of exploring mystery, the esoteric, is this beautiful thing. It's beautiful life endeavor to do. And, you know, I think of Tolkien, who borrowed from, like, well, he's immersed in the old sagas and myths and the Eddas and everything else. And it came through in his work. And then I read Tolkien, and I'm like, wow, yeah, it speaks to me at a certain level. And then I'm in the jungles of the Amazon, and I think to myself, man, if Bilbo or Frodo kept going 1,000 miles south, it would be where I'm at with pink dolphins on the Amazon River, having a shaman, you know? And yeah, I really think that the mystical is really around us all the time. And then, like, our job, or maybe the job of, like, certain individuals, each tribe has that has that connection to see beyond that veil, to see the double meaning, like that might be a rock or that might be a sun, and then at the same time to realize like that has a spirit to it and that has something special to it, and to understand that. And when you're sitting under that tree, like to realize that tree is feeling your energy and you're feeling its energy, and just like we can do with humans, there's an exchange going on there. So yeah, just for me, it's about enjoying the journey, enjoying the mystery of all of it.
Yeah, I love that. It's interesting to just take a moment and realize how therapeutic it can be, especially when we're overwhelmed, to realize that we're part of the whole. You know, it's so difficult sometimes when our personal problems become so overwhelming that you just want to break down. And sometimes all that's left is just to give it to the tree outside. You know what I mean? Well, it's been there for 120 years. I can probably get through this, you know, but like there's something so profound about how beautiful that is, because our journeys can become overwhelming when we start carrying the weight of the uncertain nature of the future. Like that's a lot for anybody to try to hold on. So let me just try to wrap my arms around this uncertainty principle here. Like it's crazy. I feel like we're at this crisis, and I'm so thankful to get to pick your guys' brains on it and stuff. I got another question coming in from the chat. It says, what can the principles of mycology teach us about building a political system that prioritizes symbiosis over competition? Why don't you take that one to start off, Ollie?
Yeah, I mean, this is an amazing question. I think really, just to be quite blunt, we would need to develop systems that are based on anarchistic principles, where we don't have a centralized point of authority and power, where we understand where, if we think about the concept of grains which are inoculated and then put into a substrate, then everyone in there, if we were to have a system of governance that was based on mycelium, then it wouldn't be, we would have to totally reimagine the political structure where it's not top down, where we have more trust and openness and honesty. And in feeling that, okay, people can be these inoculated pieces of grain in different areas of the substrate. And if we are all operating on this open level, then we can find ways where we communicate and we're sharing resources. So I think, in terms of like devolution into local governments, that kind of thing would be really useful, but you'd need to be quite careful, I think, in terms of resources. I think, non-hierarchical structures where you're not restricted by a certain time goal. I think this is the thing, when you're growing mushrooms, when you've got mycelium in a cupboard and you're colonizing some grain, if you keep looking, or you ask, how long is it going to take? And it's like, it will take as long as it takes. Now, if you had that in a cabinet meeting in the UK and someone's like, we've got these targets, we need to hit them by 2027, and the person goes, yeah, I don't know about that, it will just take as long as it takes. Because of the way in which the class structure is, where it's all dependent on results and key performance indicators. How do we know if we're doing well? Well, we've achieved this by this time, net zero by 2030 or whatever it is. So I think if we can get rid of this idea of target driven goals and look at look more in terms of systems and outcomes, like if we look at the slime mold, which was put into a model of the Tokyo subway system and found out the most efficient way to do it, and that's what the Tokyo subway system is modeled on. So it's like, if we can start modeling systems, there might be ways we can really do this in practical ways, looking at resources when it comes to food and energy, and try and create like literal physical structures and government departments which are replicating these principles. I mean, it's a really big question, and I think has many layers, but I think certainly the principles in terms of energetic sharing of resources. And even when there's competing ideas, as I mentioned before with the competing strains of fungi, you don't necessarily all have to agree on the same thing politically or philosophically. You can just realize that, hey, we are all this organism, and actually all this stuff surrounding politics and philosophy and identity politics it's a distraction. It's not really necessary. It's kind of stuff we've been holding on to for ages. If we can get rid of some of that and try and form new identities into this collective, as we've been talking about, that therapeutic realization of becoming part of the whole, and try and maybe get our political leaders, I don't know, taking lion's mane and cordyceps and reishi and not feeling so stressed out. I really do think, like, especially in the UK, where we have so many stressed out leaders that come from these, upper class systems where they would have gone to boarding school and not had connection to their parents, and really, they're coming from places of trauma, and it's like, how can we help our leaders to say, what, it's all right, and not feel like there's this scarcity, coming into these ideas of abundance and being able to share, and then we don't have to fight wars because actually there is enough to go around.
Yeah, it's really well said. I look at the political structure over here in the United States, and I have so many of the similar ideas, and you can't help but, you get angry, but then for me comes empathy of like, man, these are just human beings. These are just people, and I don't know what kind of cards they've been dealt. I have no idea what's going on in their family life. It doesn't look too good from this angle over here. Maybe Luke, you have done, I think both of you have done incredible things. One thing that I noticed about you, Luke, is that you have found a place to bloom. Like you've came to this new location and you found not only who you are, but what you love, and it's thriving, man. I know it wasn't easy to set up and start doing, but do you think that that's an answer for some people? Is like, hey, look, if you're not satisfied with this particular area, you can go somewhere and make it your home and begin to bloom where you're planted out there. Is that a strategy that you used, or is that something advice you would give to people who may be searching?
Well, I mean, talking about these political systems, I kind of felt the United States was oppressive to me, just the political system and just, like it's how everyone thinks, and well, in suburbia, and this idea to a 9-to-5 job, and all these things we just take for granted, and like I just want to do something else. I just like want to figure something else out. And for me, I was looking for deep healing because my PTSD was so bad, so I tried ayahuasca. But in that experience, I'm like, wait, why don't I try to live down here and just figure it out? And it seemed much more healthy for me. I felt better, more connected to the earth, more connected to the land, more freedom, a different place. So I made that work. So I think for a lot of people, just traveling, experiencing different cultures, just even a little bit. So I think most Americans don't even have passports. So if you just like travel a little bit and to see a little bit of the world, it'll give you a whole different perspective. And then for me, I felt like I was in a world I could remake myself and make something that was never really done before. I didn't have the constraints of the political system like the United States or UK, or psychedelics are illegal, especially at the time, and all of a sudden, like, oh, I can start doing research in this part of the world, right? And then I can start, doing studies and getting this out there, getting this knowledge out there. I think that kind of anarchist philosophy that Ollie was talking about, like, we have this idea that we have to have these governments and these superstructures, and there's like all of a sudden, like in the United States, like millions of bureaucrats, and I don't know what they do, but we think we have to have this system because we had it for so long, but maybe we don't need these systems, and maybe we should be free to do what we want, and all of a sudden, like a healthier system can like naturally emerge from the ground up. I think these are like conversations maybe we should start having. Because to be honest, all Western systems aren't sustainable right now. They're all extremely in debt. Every politician borrows from the future, and the future children are going to pay for these things. This is nuts. And this is just like the tip of the iceberg of what's happening in these political systems. And like I can have sympathy for these people in this power structure because I think they're born into it in the same way. But also I think that it's kind of concerning when you consider that UK, United States, Russia, China, all have these like massive nuclear arsenals, right? And one little off thing in one of these leaders' heads can like one little thing, one little psychological disturbance can lead to a really terrible situation, to say the least. So I think we should be open to all possibilities, and yeah, why not? You know, like we can talk about fun tree for a long time, but why not? You know, look at what something else is doing. Why not? You know, like maybe that is a good idea. Who's to say it's not? I think we should just be open-minded to everything.
Yeah, I agree. Both of you gentlemen, I have a fascinating. This is such a good time, and I feel like we just barely scratched the surface right here. 2 hours flew by like it was nothing. Like it was 2 minutes, and I probably have like another 25 questions in here, but I got a hard out coming up. So maybe we can come back and do it again. Like I really
Love to.
thankful for both of your guys' time. And while we have a little bit of time left, let's start with Luke. Luke, would you be so kind as to tell people where they can find you, what you have coming up, and what you're excited about? And then we'll shift to Ollie after that. Go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, so just this last year, we're running retreats in Peru with ayahuasca and Huachuma and brain mapping and kind of adventure, because I love the idea of having adventure with a retreat. Stay in the same space. We do mountain hiking and stuff like that. So the best way to reach me, I have 2 websites. One's called Tiwa's Awakening. Tiwa's as in the rune, the Nordic rune. And another one called Neuro Enlightenment, which kind of more stresses the neurofeedback side of things, the brain training. And Tiwa's Awakenings are adventure retreats. And both those emails, Tiwa's Awakening and Neuro Enlightenment. And the big thing we have coming up, we don't have an exact date, but we have a documentary that's finished, and it's amazing work. I'm really happy about it, and it'll be probably released here in the next couple months. So thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Ollie, you have got some incredible speeches that you've been given. You've been doing quite a bit of touring, and I was hopeful that maybe you could shed some light on what you're excited about, where people can find you, and what you've been up to, man.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm doing a talk tomorrow night online for the Psychedelic Society, which is a UK institution, on the topic of psychedelics and social justice. So I'm going to be doing more talks on this topic, and also engaging more within mycelial structures and ways of thinking. So collaborating with different organizations, like I mentioned, Mycelium Hub in Sweden, to be doing some events with them, holding some retreats next year, and doing some intensive kind of emergence events. So bringing people together at the Mycelium Hub and, finding ways to mirror this mycelial way of working and see what arises naturally. And I'm working with trades associations in the UK, liaising with different functional mushroom companies. So I do consulting for functional mushrooms, helping organizations and individuals understand how functional mushrooms can benefit them. So looking at things like the functionality of the workplace, but also looking at the functionality of the human system. So you can find me at thefungiconsultant.com. And also Ollie at the Fungi Consultant, also my Linktree, which is Linktree/Ollie Gembash. And you can find articles and talks that I've done, music as well. As I said, I'm a psychedelic musician, so that's really exciting. We've got a new album coming out next year, my band Codex Serafini, which is all intertwined with topics surrounding the spirit, the pneuma, the things which are connecting us to our inner nature. And we like to express ourselves within this wider psychedelic context and be champions, I guess, for kind of more wilder psychedelic expression, psychedelic culture, trying to draw conversations more towards that artistic, creative side of things, where it's not just scientists. So yeah,
I love it. Well, gentlemen, hang on briefly afterwards. I want to talk to you both, but to everybody within the sound of my voice, I know I got tons of other podcasters who listen to you, Doc, Clint, Doc, reach out to both these guys, incredible individuals. Ladies and gentlemen, within the sound of my voice, go down to the show notes, check out both of these gentlemen, reach out to them if you have any questions. If you enjoyed it, reach out to them. And that's all we got for today, ladies and gentlemen. Aloha.
Thank you.